You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, if I listed everything he's done, that would be the entire podcast. And it's amazing that he's a guest. Very grateful, much in awe. Leon Panetta. He has served as White House Chief of Staff, as a congressman, as the Secretary of Defense. And I was telling him before we started that he was Secretary of Defense for my son's 2 tours in Afghanistan, and the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. He is also co-chair of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. A few weeks ago, we interviewed Mike Murphy, who's the Chief of Staff, and Mr. Panetta's co-chair is Mitch Daniels. I have yelled at you so many times on television, Mr. Secretary. So if you want to tell me I'm stupid or anything during this podcast, please do, because I'm always like, if you would just listen to Pat Buchanan or Robert Novak, this country would be so much better. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It was great. It's good to be with you. It's an interesting podcast that you put together, talking to a remarkable set of leaders in the country, and I'm glad to be among those that you're interviewing.
Thank you. That's very, very kind. And I'm going to call you Secretary Panetta, if that's okay.
That's great.
Dan Coates insisted I call him Dan. And I did, but then I made him say on the podcast that I told Robert he had to call me Dan, so people didn't think I was being rude. Your time in public service is absolutely incredible, but I want to start really at the beginning, at the love of country, and the love of country that immigrants have, your family has, having come over when they did. Did that lead you and help you love a life of public service?
Oh, without question. I often say that I am the son of Italian immigrants. My parents came to this country like millions of others who came to this country, and very little money in their pocket, very little language ability, but they really sought the opportunity that this country had to offer. And I often used to ask my dad, why did he come all that distance to a strange land? And even though they came from a poor area in Italy, they had the comfort of family and friends. Why would you just pick up and travel thousands of miles to a strange land? What were your reasons? And he said, your mother and I really believed that we could give our children a better life in this country. And I think that's the American dream. I think that's what we want for our children, hopefully what they'll want for their children. And my parents, it was a typical Italian family. We used to have Sunday dinners, and my parents used to always make clear to my brother and I that we owed something back to the country because of what this country gave them in terms of opportunity. There were really 3 things that influenced my going into public service. One was my parents, without question, and their devotion to the country and to public service. The other was my time in the military. I think being in the military at a time when the draft was on and you were working with people from across the country on a common mission and watching them work together in order to take a hill, that really it enthused me about how important it is to try to work together in order to accomplish a mission by a lot of people devoted to the country. And then thirdly, there was a young president who said to the country, ask not what your nation can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And all of that really, really did push me into public service.
What was it like growing up in California when you did? I'll only say your age because it's on the website. You're 86 years old, so you were born means 1938, is that right?
That's right. That's right.
So you grew up remembering World War II, because my mother was born in 38 here in Indianapolis, and she certainly remembers it. Actually, my mother ended up being the first female Marine Corps recruit in Indianapolis after World War II.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
But in California, it was different because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, because of the internment camps. Just please tell us a little bit about what you remember as a child about World War II in California.
Yeah, it's something I think a lot about, particularly having served in the military and then being Secretary of Defense. And you're always thinking about what it's like to be in the middle of a war. And I was just, born in 1938 and was just, 4 or 5 years old. But I can remember distinctly that my parents had to buy blackout shades and put them in all the windows. And you had to pull those shades down because there were people who were checking to make sure that we were all implementing security precautions, because we were on the West Coast and there was always the fear. I can even remember it as a kid, the fear that the Japanese might very well attack the West Coast of California, having attacked Pearl Harbor. So it was fascinating to be living at that time. But my dad ran a restaurant downtown Monterey during the war years. And it was a time that was really, Monterey was jumping. It was not only a lot of fish getting caught and Cannery Row, Steinbeck's Cannery Row was being developed, but there was a military reservation called Fort Ord. And they were training young men for the battlefields of World War II. And their last stop with civilization was downtown Monterey. And I can remember as a kid walking downtown Monterey and seeing all of these uniforms. I'd go into my dad's restaurant and there were always a bunch of soldiers that were there. As a matter of fact, my parents used to invite them to our home for the holidays. And I can remember as a boy thinking, these are young men who are going to be going to war and putting their lives on the line. I never forgot that, particularly when I became Secretary of Defense, because the toughest thing you have to do, frankly, is deploy forces into harm's way. And I always thought about those young kids that I met as a young boy who were going to the battlefields of the Pacific. So it was a fascinating time to be living. And the one thing I always remember is that everybody pulled together. We were gathering rubber, we were gathering tires, we were doing whatever we could to try to help the war effort. And there were a lot of kids in our neighborhood who had gone to war, and we were following wherever they went, because it was a family affair to try to share our concern about making sure that their lives were safe.
We are coming up and have actually celebrated some of the 80th anniversaries. Battle of Okinawa, Battle of Iwo Jima, VE Days coming up.
Yep.
Obviously, VJ Day coming up in September. Do you remember those dates? Do you remember, for example, when the atomic bomb was dropped and all of that?
I do. I remember hearing FDR on the radio, and my parents had tremendous respect for Roosevelt, and we all paid attention to what he was saying. And I remember them gathering around the radio and listening to his fireside chats. And I can remember that we really were concerned that, having seen what happened in Pearl Harbor, that it was very possible that at some point, some kind of attack might take place in Monterey, California. So, when you live with something like that, when you're in the middle of a war, a world war, the way we were then, it's not something that just comes and goes. It's with you almost every day, because you think about what it means to be able to pull together to try to make sure that we deal with challenges that are facing not just our country and our community, but each of us.
It comes as no surprise as a Republican that I think that Ronald Reagan did many good things. Very high on my list, and hopefully others as well, is 1988 when he paid reparations to the families of the Japanese who were interned then. What did you think of that legislation? What did you think of that act?
Well, it was fascinating because we had Japanese in Monterey. We had Japanese in the Salinas Valley who were working in the fields in the Salinas Valley. And so we knew some of the Japanese who had to be interred at that time. And in addition to that, there were, people really did care for their property to make sure that when ultimately the war came to an end, that they would be able to get their property back because that was important. And they did. And the Japanese actually became great members of our community. They became community leaders. We had a mayor who was Japanese descent in Salinas, California. I was very good friends with Norm Panetta, who actually had been in the camp.
Yeah, that's right.
And so knowing Norm very well, he worked a lot on that issue. We were in Congress together. And I was really, really proud of President Reagan for taking that step and providing some kind of reparations for just imagine how these people who were citizens of this country, pulled out of their homes and sent to an internment camp. I have to tell you, I had my Italian grandfather came over to visit in 1938 to visit my mother. And because he was an alien, they didn't let him go back to Italy. So I kind of grew up with my as we called them in Italian. And then they decided to take the Italians and move them inland from the coast. And so he had to leave our family residence in Monterey, and we had to take him up to San Jose. Wasn't that far from Monterey, but we had to take him up there so he could live in a rooming house up there away from the coast. So I understand a little bit of what the Japanese went through and the tremendous separation that took place. And I'm really glad that the country finally faced up to what was, without question, a wrong step to take.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our very special guest is distinguished public servant Leon Panetta. Where would you be? And I'm asking this question completely out of sequence because I don't want to forget. Where would you be without Sylvia Panetta, whom you married in 1962?
Well, I sure as hell would never have been able to accomplish all of the different jobs that I've had without the support of Sylvia. We met back at Santa Clara. I went to Santa Clara University, a Jesuit school out here, and I was a student body officer. And one of the things we did, it was an all-men's school at the time, but we used to invite the Catholic women's schools down to Santa Clara for a reception. And Sylvia was up at Dominican and came down on a bus, and I saw her get off the bus, and I immediately was attracted to her. This is almost 66 years ago, 67 years ago. And we were able to hook up, and, we started going together and got married. We've now been married 63 years this coming July. And she's always been, not just the love of my life, she's been my partner in life. And she's always been right there. She volunteered as my chief of staff when I was elected to Congress, ran my district offices. I didn't get paid for it. But let me tell you something, there's no better person to run your district office than your wife, because people were comfortable talking to her. They knew they were talking to me. And then she's always been my partner. And then obviously we came together and established our Institute for Public Policy, which is where I'm talking from today. And she has really run the Institute here. When I had to go back as CIA director and Secretary of Defense, she basically took over running this policy institute. And let me tell you, obviously, I had to spend a lot of time going back to Washington, working in Washington, and the ability to have somebody like Sylvia be here and be here when I came home. And we raised three boys, and she deserves tremendous credit for holding the family together, and most importantly, giving me the support that I needed in order to do the job that I had to do in different positions.
Happy early anniversary to you both.
Thank you.
Secretary Panetta is a Monterey native, Santa Clara University School of Law graduate. He served in the United States Army from 1964 to 1966. I've never met anyone in the military who served in the military who didn't think it was, if not the best decision they ever made, at the very top. Where does your military service rank with you in terms of preparing yourself for your future career?
Oh, it was really critical. That's why I say, when I think about what inspired me to get involved in public service, that experience in the Army, and as I said, it was during the draft period, and there were people from across the country who were coming together. And I remember working with a platoon of individuals from around the whole country, but we were training and working together, and we were able to really put our whole effort into, as I say, taking the hill together. And that experience is very important. And I think back on it a lot, particularly now, because I deal with a lot of young people. And I have to kind of share a concern that these young people are, for a lot of reasons, they really don't have a good foundation in our democracy, in our Constitution, and they really aren't drawn to public service the same way. That's why we started our institute, was to try to inspire young people to lives of public service. I really think we ought to seriously think in this country about some kind of national service system that requires young people to provide 2 years of service to this country. It doesn't just have to be in the military. It can be in education. It can be in conservation. It could be in other areas. But I think young people need to know what duty to country is all about and learn the discipline that is important to people coming together and working on a common mission. I think that's really important for our country in the future.
I don't know that I've agreed more with anything that anyone on the podcast has ever said. I agree. 2 years is nothing in the span of an 85-year lifetime. Not only would you serve your country, but the one thing, and you know this about the military, but national service, however defined, you never know who you're going to be bunking with. And he may just, or she may just turn out to be the best friend you ever had.
No, that's it. I think just the ability to be able to listen and work with people who don't just come from California, but come from Texas and Mississippi and Alabama and the East Coast and the Northwest and the Midwest, and talk to them and listen to them and work with them makes you really appreciate the diversity of this country. And makes you really appreciate what this country is all about, because no matter where they come from, they share some of the fundamental values that I think we all share in families. They have families where, both parents have to work. They have to raise their kids. They have to buy a home. They have to get a good job. They worry about healthcare. They worry about trying to make sure their community does well. And when you can bring these people together so that everybody learns from others, that's what really makes our country even stronger.
Beginning in 1966, Secretary Panetta was a legislative assistant to a Republican senator in California, moderate Republican at the time. This period of public service, along with the end of your time in the Army, is just at the dawn of what Gerald Ford called our long national nightmare, if you put Vietnam and Watergate together. What are your thoughts about that period? I've done several podcasts with Vietnam historians. I've done 3 or 4 on just the year 1968, several on Nixon and Johnson. When you look back and everyone talks about how, 2025 is worse than it's ever been in our country, but 1968, 1860, where do you put that time period, the mid to late 60s, as your career was just taking off? Where do you put that in historical context?
You know, I think it's one of those periods where this country was being tested. I can remember, you know, when I went back to Washington as a legislative assistant to Tom Kuchel. I often say I've seen Washington at its best and Washington at its worst. The good news was Washington worked when I went back there. There were Republicans like Tom Kuchel, Jacob Javits from New York, Clifford Case from New Jersey, George Aiken from Vermont, moderate Republicans, other Republicans. I mean, Everett Dirksen was worked very closely with Johnson on civil rights bills, but they had their politics, but they worked together. They worked together on issues facing the country. And, I saw it when I first got elected to Congress. Tip O'Neill was Democrat, but he worked very closely with Bob Michael, who was a Republican from Illinois. And they fought each other in elections. They had different views. But when it came to big issues, they worked together. And it was really, as somebody who served in the Congress, I have to tell you, it was great to be there. I'm often asked what job I like the best out of all the jobs I've had. I got to tell you, being in Congress when it worked was really a great experience because you can get things done. So, being back there and then, seeing some of the changes that took place when I was in Washington, and I was there when Martin Luther King had gotten assassinated, when Bobby Kennedy got assassinated, when we were going through the throes of Vietnam, and there was this turmoil in the country, and you weren't quite sure ultimately how we would come out of it. And it it, it makes you think that even today, when we're going through a lot of testing of our democracy and will it survive, it made me a believer in American leadership because, we've been through a hell of a lot in this country. We've been through civil wars and world wars. We've been through recessions and depression, but somehow we've always found the right leadership to be able to get us through it. And I'm a believer in America being resilient, because frankly, our strength is not in Washington. Our strength is in the communities in this country in which people really do work together to try to benefit their community. De Tocqueville said something that was really important. He said, the great thing about America that was different from Europe is that Americans really have that sense of community about how you work together to try to make sure that your community does well. So whatever the hell is happening in Washington, whatever the hell is tearing our country apart, I still have great faith in the spirit and resilience of Americans who are willing to do what's necessary in order to make their community survive.
You mentioned your favorite job was in Congress, so forgive me if I do a humble Hoosier brag about some of the people with whom you served. I'm going to name a few names and you just kind of give me a sentence or two or a joke or however you want to do it. And I have to start off with someone to whom I got to be close and I admire greatly, and that's Andy Jacobs Jr.
Yeah, yeah. Andy was a great representative. He was not your standard member of Congress. I got to tell you, he was always had something to say. I can remember walking on the floor and I'd say, Andy, what's cooking here? He says, we are doomed. It's a great quote. He always used to say, we are doomed. There's just nobody is doing the right thing right now. But it was just, he was a great individual. He had great instincts. And, even though he was cantankerous as hell, he was just a great person to kind of share thoughts with.
And a true patriot.
Really.
John Bradamus.
John Bradamus, somebody, when I went back to Congress, there were some great role models for me because Congress really had great leadership at that time. I mentioned Tip O'Neill. I just got an award from the Foley Institute, their Distinguished Service Award, named in honor of Tom Foley.
Speaker Tom Foley.
Tom Foley was a great guy. He was a statesman. He was devoted to this country. And John Bradamus was the same way. John Bradamus was somebody, came from an area of the country where he really was in touch with, America. And he always was somebody who you could trust to stand by his conscience. That's not always the case in Washington.
Sure.
But John Bradamus would always, I knew that if I went up to John and said, what do you think about this issue? John would tell me, he would level with me about whether he thought it was in the interest of the country or not, or whether he thought it was BS. And I really appreciated that. And so he became a mentor of mine because he really committed himself to doing everything he could to make the institution work. And that's not easy, but John Bradamus is a real hero.
Birch Bayh.
Birch Bayh. I knew Birch Bayh because I worked in the Senate for Tom Kuechel, and Bayh had an office right across from Tom Kuechel's office. And I have to tell you, he had some of the prettiest women from Indiana working there that I saw. But from a morale point of view, you couldn't beat it. And
Nancy Pappas, if you're listening, he's talking about you. That's all I got to say. I did a podcast about the career of Birch Bayh, and she was one of the guests. She was wonderful. And since you mentioned beauty, I figure I'd give her a shout out.
Oh, no question. But Birch Bayh in many ways was he was a younger generation at that point. I was working obviously with guys who were older. We had, as I said, Tom Kuechel and Javits, and Henry Jackson was there. Douglas was there. There were just a lot of people who had been around. But he was kind of a younger generation coming out of Indiana, and he had this kind of instinctive approach to what do we need to do in order to make our democracy better. I mean, this is a guy who developed amendments to the Constitution. He was willing to work at it. That's not easy to do. But people listened to him because he was smart, because he did his work. He did his homework, and he had a good style about him. And so I think Birch Bayh was, in my book, I think he is a great model for those that are serving in public life today, because he was committed to doing what he thought was right for the country. And sometimes it cost him politically. But I have to tell you, he did what he thought was right. And that, I wish more people approach Washington on that basis instead of just worrying about whether they're going to save their rear end, and have them worry more about what's going to happen with the country.
My personal favorite, Senator Richard Lugar.
Oh, Dick Lugar, what a great guy. When I first went back to Washington, I worked on the Ag Committee with Tom Foley, who was the chairman. And the Ag Committee was one of those committees where Republicans and Democrats really did work together. And that was true on the Republican side and on the Senate side as well. Bob Dole, Dick Lugar, they really worked hard to try to develop compromise and consensus on a lot of issues. And Dick Lugar not only was great on ag issues, particularly for Indiana, but Dick Lugar became a foreign policy guru who really cared about our national security and cared about our foreign policy. And, he's another example of people sometimes who had to take some very tough stands that weren't necessarily politically popular, but he did it because he thought it was the right thing to do for the country. And I have to tell you, Dick Lugar is, again, another one of those mentors who really made clear that you have to ask the fundamental question, not if this is Republican or Democrat, not if this is, going to serve your own interests, but is it going to make our country better? That was the test that Dick Lugar always provided. So it was really, learning from Dick Lugar, learning from John Bradamus and these others. That is the great part of an institution like the Congress when it's working.
Right.
And when you have people who are statesmen who are there because they really care about the country. I mean, our democracy can work. God, it can work. It's not working today, but it can work if there are really people who are committed to making it work. And that requires leadership. I tell the students here at the Panetta Institute, in a democracy, we govern either by leadership or by crisis. If leadership is there, willing to make the tough decisions, involved in leadership, and that's what Dick Lugar was about, and Bradamus and others, if they're making the right decision, then we can avoid crisis. But if that leadership is not there, then we'll govern by crisis. And unfortunately, today, for too long, we've been governing by crisis.
Read a biography of Winston Churchill, and it hit that point over and over and over. You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our very special guest is distinguished public servant Leon Panetta. He co-founded the Panetta Institute for Public Policy with his wife, Sylvia, whom he married in 1962. It was established in 1997. He is maybe the only one who can unite Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower, as he has received both the Henry S. Truman Good Neighbor Award and the National Defense Industrial Association's Dwight D. Eisenhower Award. I guess we should say they did reconcile in the limo on the way to JFK's funeral after a very, very bitter feud.
Yeah.
So much more I want to ask you about in the few minutes in the time we have remaining, but I want to ask you a question about something that's happening now, and then maybe go back a bit. Pope Francis just passed. As a Roman Catholic, I should say, as am I. Are you enraptured by the whole conclave and the selection process? And do you have any spies in the Vatican that can be helpful at all?
Well, if I told you, I'd have to kill you. So
Because you worked in the highest levels of government, and then there's a secret, very historic and cool, if I may say, process. Does it interest you to an nth degree?
Oh, it does. And as a lifelong Roman Catholic, I really have followed that for a long time. And, although I guess people have mixed reviews, if you watch the movie Conclave, it actually kind of captures some of the politics of the cardinals trying to work together on selecting a new pope. And I can remember when I was chief of staff going to Rome with President Clinton and being in the Vatican. And I brought my wife with me, and the president was called to go see the Pope. And Sylvia and I were standing in the Sistine Chapel by ourselves. We're the only ones in the Sistine Chapel. And looking around, and I remember saying to her, I said, "You realize we're the only people right now in the Sistine Chapel, and this is the place where those conclaves take place that decided, but also, as you know, it's all of that remarkable art by Michelangelo that's part of it. It's interesting, as a young Catholic, you're always told, obviously that the priests and the cardinals all know what they're doing. What I've learned is that, whether it's politics in Washington or whether it's politics in Rome, the reality is that there's a lot of politics involved because there are people involved and they all have their different views. They all have their different positions, and they got to kind of try to work it through and try to find consensus. And that's okay. That's in many ways, that's what the democratic process is all about. So I think these cardinals, and I think that Pope Francis appointed a lot of cardinals that kind of share his view about broadening the reach of the Catholic Church, which I think is important to do. I think it'll be interesting how they all come together. I think obviously, they want to protect unity, but they also know that they have to protect diversity as well.
I'm would have never forgiven myself in the litany of Hoosier public servants if I had forgotten to ask you about Lee Hamilton.
Oh my God. I'm glad you did because Lee is the best of the best. I worked very closely with Lee when I was in Congress. And again, he's one of these individuals that when you said, Lee, what is this issue about? You always got a straight answer. He never pulled his punches. He always told you what he thought was in the best interest of the country. And he was always there to try to make sure that we did the right thing. I had a chance to serve with Lee on the Iraq study group. He and Jim Baker were the co-chairs. And to go through that process of looking at what was happening in Iraq, talk about what the United States needed to do in order to really be able to provide positive leadership. It was a great experience to work with Lee and to work with Jim Baker as well. But Lee again, we talked a lot about the quintessential public servant. That's what Lee Hamilton is all about. It was all about service to the country. And I have to tell you that Lee Hamilton will go down in history as one of the more outstanding members of the Congress of the United States.
It's April 2025. Does the sentence, quote, Panetta joined the Nixon administration, close quote, seem a little surreal?
Yeah, it's I've had an interesting career in public politics, but I was working with Tom Kuchel, and Kuchel got defeated by a right-wing Republican. That was just beginning to happen in those days. And Max Rafferty, I think was his name. He was the head of education in California. He beat Kuchel, and then Alan Cranston beat him in the November election. But the Nixon administration was coming in, and Bob Finch was named Secretary of HEW. And he invited a guy who worked in the state assembly, Jack Veneman, to become his deputy. Well, Jack Veneman worked very closely with Kuchel and with myself when I was working with Kuchel. And so Jack asked me if I wanted to come down to HEW to work as an assistant to the secretary, which I did. But one of the issues that was blowing up almost from the get-go was civil rights enforcement. I'd worked on civil rights bills with Kuchel, was at the White House with Lyndon Johnson signing those important civil rights bills. I was very committed to trying to make sure we could enforce civil rights laws. And so I was asked to then become director of the Office for Civil Rights. The problem was that Nixon had pretty much cut a deal with Southern Republicans in which, in exchange for their support, because he was running against Rockefeller, in exchange for their support, he promised that he would kind of back off of strong civil rights enforcement. Well, I wasn't aware of the deal. I always thought that Nixon, as a Quaker, had been committed to civil rights. But when I got into the job of director, found out there was a tremendous amount of political pressure not to strongly enforce the laws relating to, obviously, trying to give young Black kids an opportunity to get an equal education. And so a lot of pressure came down on me. I remember telling my wife that there's a lot of pressure. I'm not sure whether I'm going to be able to hold this job or not. And I said, I have to continue to do what I think is right. And she said, you do. Gave me a lot of support in making that decision. And then you'll enjoy this. One morning I got up and we got the Washington Post, and there was an article that said Panetta resigns as director of the Office for Civil Rights. Well, I hadn't resigned. So I remember going down to the office and I talked to the secretary and I said, there's this story about my resigning, but I haven't resigned. He said, no, just deny it. It's just, a lot of political gamesmanship going on. But then they had the press conference with Ron Ziegler, who was the press secretary for Richard Nixon, and they asked him, "What about this story that Panetta has resigned?" And he said, "Oh no, that's accurate. That's true. He has resigned." But so I looked at the secretary and said, "All right, I see the writing on the wall. Submitted my resignation." But
As someone who worked briefly inside the administration, you didn't work, in the Oval Office per se, but in someone who I know loves history, which is the main reason I wanted to talk to you, and I'm very grateful. When you watched Watergate unfold, you weren't in Congress yet. You were elected in 76. Is it something that made you go, yeah, I can believe this, or no, this story's crazy?
no, having been on the inside and hadn't seen some of the way a lot of the players were operating, it's one of those things where you knew it was just a matter of time that somebody would make a serious mistake. And that's what happened. And so it really didn't surprise me. And in some ways I thought, thank God I got out when I did. But it's, you know, it's something that's important for all of us to think about, that, we elect people to important positions in Washington. They're human beings, and they bring all of their strengths and all of their weaknesses to those jobs. And in many ways, that's how, you can kind of test individuals by whether their strong points come out or whether their weak points come out. And if they're trying to cut corners, if they're trying to take shortcuts in order to get things done that they otherwise don't feel they could do, that's when they get hurt. And that's when they pay a price. And it happened to Richard Nixon. He was trying to cut corners. And, I have to say, Nixon had his strong points. He actually provided strong foreign policy guidance. He opened up the door to China, did a lot of other things. He was very good that way. But he had a side of him that sometimes when the dark side takes over, it can undermine your entire legacy as president.
Did you ever get a chance to talk to him about it?
I talked to Nixon, obviously, when I was in office. I had the chance to talk with him, and did have a chance when I was in the Clinton administration early on. I had a chance to make contact with him as well.
A lot of people say there's executive temperament, there's administrative or maybe legislative temperament. You were in the legislature, but you also served as budget director, chief of staff under President Clinton, another history buff I'd love to have on the podcast, by the way. We can argue about the Civil War. You also served as Secretary of Defense, head of CIA, executive positions. How are you able to do so well in both? And do you believe that sort of categorization of, well, he just doesn't have an executive temperament?
Well, it's always dangerous to engage in generalities, but I think it is true that if you spend a lot of time in the Congress, that what you're basically doing in the Congress is you're trying to find consensus, you're trying to develop compromise, you're trying to work with others, and you don't get a lot of experience in having to make tough decisions, about policy. And so there is a difference. And some people, go into the executive branch, and the problem in the executive branch is that the tough issues that you have to confront are not going to go away. When you're on Capitol Hill, if you're facing some tough decisions, if you just keep your mouth shut and keep your head down, you always hope the problem will go away. It doesn't happen in the White House. You got to ultimately make a decision. And it really requires the ability to be decisive, to come down, to make a decision that you think is right, and to move on. I can remember with Bill Clinton, who at least had the administrative experience of being a governor of a state. I think that that's kind of important. to have that experience because you're working on budgets, you're working on policy, you've got to make decisions. And Bill Clinton was able to do that. Although Bill Clinton would struggle because he wanted to make the right decision. He'd come down, he'd make the decision. I'd walk out of his office, and 5 minutes later, he was calling me saying, "Did I make the right decision?" I said, "No, Mr. President, you don't have time to go over this. I got a dozen other decisions here for you to make that you're going to have to make." And he learned. I mean, he was really pretty good at it. I remember when we were doing the budget, and it was tough decisions because he was trying to do deficit reduction, something that neither Republicans or Democrats are interested in these days. But he was trying to do deficit reduction, and he was trying to make some tough decisions on spending, on entitlements, and on revenues. And we were going through it. I was his director of O&D at the time. And he looked at me and he said, "If I do this, I'm likely not to get reelected." And I said, "Mr. President," and Bob Rubin was there with me at the time. He was Secretary of Treasury. And we looked at him and said, "Mr. President, I know this is a tough decision, but if you make the right decision and we are able to really put our country on a fiscal track towards trying to discipline the budget, ultimately it'll come back to reward you." And I think he honestly thought he probably would never get that chance. But he made a tough decision. It was the right decision. And ultimately, we not only balanced the budget, but we got a surplus. And it got him reelected as a result of making that kind of decision. So, yeah, it's tough. I don't try to in any way, play down how tough it is in the White House to make tough decisions. But if you're willing to stick with it and make the right decision, ultimately it'll come back to your benefit.
We have a few more minutes with Leon Panetta, co-founder of the Panetta Institute for Public Policy. Did Newt Gingrich's revolution, if that's the right word, in 94 when he became speaker, was that good for President Clinton?
Well, at first the president was depressed as hell. He thought everything was going to hell. And I remember when he lost both the House and the Senate, I had just become chief of staff. And I remember George Stephanopoulos said, "Somebody's got to go out and talk to the press." And I said, I just came into this job. You worried to go out there and face the president? He said, "Yeah." So I remember going out and facing the press after that. And obviously I congratulated Gingrich and the Republicans on their victory. But I also said something that I thought was important. I said, "Look, the real test is not whether you win elections. The real test is whether or not you can govern and do the right thing for the country. And that'll ultimately determine really whether or not what's happened here will go down in history." And, I can remember the president, as I said, being very, very depressed about it. And I kept saying to him, I said, "Look, this could be an opportunity. Could be an opportunity. Gingrich is not dumb. He's smart. He could be somebody you could work with." Well, and Gingrich was caught up in the Contract for America and decided he had to go to war with Clinton because he'd won. And sometimes you just make a bad judgment about what kind of mandate the public was giving you. And so he went to war with the president over the budget. And we were having tough battles. We were trying to negotiate and trying to see if we could get some kind of deal worked out. And Gingrich decided that he was not going to compromise. I think it was on Medicare cuts. He was not going to compromise. And so he shut the government down. And when he shut the government down, I can remember Bob Dole, who was a very pragmatic Republican, saying, "What the hell are you doing? Well, we don't want to shut the government down. It'll come back to haunt us." But they went ahead and did it. And it was a few days of a shutdown. I think it was about a week. And the politics were really going against the Republicans. And they finally broke and decided to pass the budget. And I remember after that Gingrich kind of made a decision. It might be better if we try to work with the president than try to kick him around. And so the president, to his credit, recognized that there were areas like welfare reform, healthcare for kids, other education areas where they could basically work a compromise out, and they did. They did. And I think it not only benefited the president, but in the end, it actually benefited the Republicans as well.
You mentioned this is my last question before we get to the 5 questions we ask all of our guests, including, by the way, your former colleague, Christopher Cox. He came on to discuss his biography of Woodrow Wilson, which is very good, by the way. You mentioned tough decisions. One of them, I know you have so many, but of course, you supervised the operation to find and eliminate Osama bin Laden. What were the goosebumps like on that day?
Well, it's one of those great experiences where, you're working with good people, good intelligence officers, working with special forces, and, the ability to find that compound. And we never really knew for sure whether bin Laden was there, although there was a mysterious family living on the 3rd floor. We looked at the clothes on the clothesline and determined that it had the same number of family members as in the bin Laden family. And one day, I'll just share this. It was an individual who came out and walked in circles. We were doing 24/7 reconnaissance. And this individual would come out, he's a little older, he'd walk in circles and go right back in. And I remember telling the CIA, for goodness sakes, that could be bin Laden. Give me a telescope, give me a movie camera, give me something that can give me a facial ID, because it could be bin Laden. And they said, we just can't do it. There's 18-foot walls on one side, 12-foot walls on another side. And I remember saying to them, look, I've seen movies where the CIA can do this, Dan. All laughed about that, but we never had 100%. And when we developed the mission to go after it, it was a tough decision. Went to the National Security Council. There were a lot of people that were concerned about it, but ultimately the president made the decision to go. And I had to head it up because it was a covert operation, and so we established headquarters at the CIA. And we followed the helicopters and the 2 teams of SEALs into Afghanistan. It was at night, 150 miles, two teams of SEALs. And when one of the helicopters got over the compound, because it had been hot that day, it stalled one of the engines.
Mm-hmm.
You could see the helicopter go down with the tail up on the wall. And I remember talking to Bill McRaven, who was head of Special Forces. He was out in Afghanistan. I said, what the hell's going on, Bill? It's one of those moments where your stomach's in your mouth.
And you can remember Desert One, the aborted.
Exactly. And that's why some people opposed it in the national security discussion. So I said, what the hell's going on? And he didn't miss a beat. He said, don't worry. We've got backup helicopters coming in. We're going to breach through the walls. We're going to go ahead with the mission. And I said, God bless you. Let's do it. And he did. And they went in. It was, I could hear gunfire, and then there was about 20 minutes of silence. The longest 20 minutes in my life.
Yeah, no kidding. Nerve-wracking. That's why I asked about the goosebumps.
And then Bill came back on. He said, I think we have a Geronimo, which was the code word for getting bin Laden. And then a few minutes later, he said, we have a Geronimo. But they still had to gather everything together. They had to get intelligence. They had to get the helicopter that was down, destroy that, and get in the air and fly all the way back to Afghanistan. But I can remember, after the president's announcement that night, that crowds were gathering in front of the White House in Lafayette Park, and they were yelling, USA, USA, CIA, CIA. I never thought I would ever hear a crowd yell the CIA. But it was one of those great moments where everybody came together in a common mission, working together and sending a message to the world that nobody attacks our country and gets away with it.
Your point's well taken about the CIA chant, especially considering your political career really began when people were chanting not so nice things about LBJ. When your head hit the pillow that night, what were you thinking? The night that this man who killed so many people was brought to justice, it was going to electrify the country, dominate the news cycle. You went to bed that night and?
It's one of those moments where, you're so wired by everything that's going on and by following, something that, you put a lot of planning into and a lot of work into it. And to have it go right and have everything go right, I have to tell you, I don't think I slept better than that night as a result of that. I'll tell you one other thing. That's a great story, Robert. We had found the compound in August of 2010. New Year's Eve of 2011, we were having a dinner, a New Year's Eve dinner, and a good friend of mine runs the Sardine Factory, which is a restaurant here in Monterey. And he started, talking about the different wines in his wine cellar where we were having dinner. And he said, I really have the best wine I have is the Lafite Rothschild 1897 or something like that. It's worth about 15,000. And I said to him, I said, well, when are you going to open that bottle of wine? And he looked at me. We played golf together. He said, look, you can't even find your own golf ball. And you sure as hell can't find bin Laden. I'll tell you what, when you find bin Laden, I'll open that bottle of wine. And I said to him, because we had already been doing surveillance, I said, you're on. I didn't say, you're on. So on May 1, when we did the operation, I called my wife, Sylvia, and I said, Sylvia, call Ted. Tell him to watch the president's announcement tonight. It's on television. And tell him that he owes me a bottle of wine. She did. She called him and left a message, didn't get a hold of him. But he did watch the president. And then he called Sylvia back and she picked up the phone. There was a lot of silence. And he said, the son of a bitch. And there was more silence. He said, the son of a bitch. He set me up.
Well, how did it taste?
And you know what? It's not worth 15,000, but it was a great moment when we did open it. We had other good wines that were much better. A lot of fun.
We've reached the point here in our last few minutes with Secretary Leon Panetta. We ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. Secretary, what was your first job?
My first job was, besides working like hell for my father, whether it was the restaurant or the walnut orchard, the first real job I had was in a delicatessen in Carmel, California, the Mediterranean market. I was in high school and was working at that job. That was the first one I ever had.
Are you friends with the former mayor of Carmel, California, Mr. Clint Eastwood?
I sure am. He's actually served on our board and has been very supportive. Good guy.
Second question, what was your first concert?
My first concert was my piano concert. I did it at Sunset Hall in Carmel, California. I had a great teacher and I really played a full concert on stage. I think I was 12 years old when I did it.
If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book, besides your memoir, Worthy Fights, which book would you recommend?
I think the best book I'd recommend to people, particularly if they're interested in history, is John Adams by David. I can't think of his last name.
David McCulloch.
McCulloch. Yeah, great book.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, any event in history, which one would you choose?
Well, I mean, the Catholic part of me says it would have been nice to have been in Nazareth at that point. But the political side of me says, it would really have been great to have been in the audience when Lincoln gave his Gettysburg Address.
That's that and the resurrection are probably the 2 most popular answers. I've done 310 interviews, and I think those are the top 2. Last question, and this is somewhat unfair because you've already had dinner with so many amazing people. But if you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Well, if it had been a few days ago, I'd probably say sitting down with the Pope would probably have been really interesting to have that conversation with Pope Francis. You know, in his absence, I'd probably say that it would really be good to have a conversation with and a dinner with Bill Clinton again, because Bill Clinton, I really loved having worked for him. But Bill Clinton always had this remarkable ability to kind of look at the country and the state of the country and always kind of figure out, just exactly what is it that we need to do in order to try to get back on track. And if there's anything I think we need to do right now, it's to get back on track.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise and federally certified veteran-owned small business. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister, a soldier who landed in North Africa in November 1942 with the first wave. Our guest today, Leon Panetta. As you can tell by listening to this podcast, there's very few things he hasn't done, very few people he hasn't met, but more than that, very few things he hasn't done for his country. Secretary Panetta, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Robert, it's been great. I want to send my regards to all of your listeners, but in particular, thank you for doing what you're doing, because I think probably the most important thing we need to do these days is to talk a lot with one another so that we can all gain the strength we're going to need in order to make sure that our democracy survives.
Thank you, sir, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.